The question arrived. In a concentration camp, Barak threw a fellow prisoner's despair. Why don't we just run into the electric fence and end this? Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and prisoner number 119104, found himself facing not just a personal crisis, but a fundamental challenge to everything psychology claimed to understand about human motivation. If Freud was right that humans seek pleasure above all, why weren't more prisoners choosing immediate escape from pain? If Adler was correct that the will to power drives behavior, why did some prisoners maintain dignity while others with more power collapsed? In that moment, observing who survived psychologically and who didn't, Frankl glimpsed something that would reshape his understanding of human nature entirely. The prisoners who endured weren't those with the strongest bodies or the most advantageous positions. They were those who had found a reason to live that transcended their immediate circumstances. This observation would eventually challenge the foundational assumptions of psychology itself, proposing that humans are driven neither by pleasure nor power, but by something far more complex and profound. Part 1. The Will to Meaning, Philosophical Foundations and Psychological Architecture. The will to meaning represents Frankl's most radical departure from established psychological thought, but understanding its significance requires examining both its philosophical origins and its psychological mechanisms. Unlike Freud's pleasure principle or Adler's will to power, the will to meaning suggests that humans possess an irreducible drive toward purpose that cannot be explained by more basic motivations. This is not simply a higher-order need that emerges once basic needs are met, as Maslow would later propose. Instead, Frankl argued that meaning-seeking operates as a primary motivational force that can override even survival instincts under certain circumstances. The philosophical roots of this concept extend back to existential thinkers like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. But Frankl's contribution lies in translating existential insights into psychological mechanisms. Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety as the dizziness of freedom informed Frankl's understanding of how people respond to life's inherent meaninglessness. When faced with the recognition that existence has no predetermined purpose, people experience what Kierkegaard called anxiety, and what Frankl termed the existential vacuum. But unlike purely philosophical treatments of this condition, Frankl identified specific psychological processes that determine whether people succumb to despair or create meaning despite uncertainty. The neurological substrate of meaning-seeking reveals fascinating connections between cognitive and emotional brain systems. Modern neuroscience suggests that the experience of meaning involves complex interactions between the prefrontal cortex, which handles abstract reasoning and future planning, and the limbic system, which processes emotions and motivation. When people encounter situations that align with their deeply held values, brain imaging shows activation patterns similar to those seen in addiction, suggesting that meaning may literally be psychologically addictive. This neurological evidence supports Frankl's observation that people will endure tremendous hardship for meaningful purposes, while becoming deeply distressed in comfortable but meaningless circumstances. The phenomenology of meaning-seeking differs qualitatively from other motivational states. When driven by pleasure-seeking, people focus on obtaining specific experiences or sensations. When motivated by power, they concentrate on achieving control or status. But when pursuing meaning, people orient themselves towards something beyond immediate self-interest. This self-transcendent quality distinguishes the will to meaning from other psychological drives and explains why traditional behavioral modification techniques often fail to address existential concerns. Frankl's clinical observations revealed that the will to meaning operates through what he called the motivational hierarchy reversal. In most psychological theories, higher-order needs depend on the satisfaction of lower-order ones. Food, safety, and social connection must be secured before people can pursue self-actualization or spiritual growth. But Frankl noted that when meaning is at stake, people regularly sacrifice pleasure, power, and even survival. Martyrs choose death over compromising their values. Parents sacrifice personal happiness for their children's welfare, and scientists dedicate their lives to abstract truths that offer no material reward. This hierarchy reversal operates through specific psychological mechanisms that Frankl termed new dynamics, distinguishing them from psychodynamics. While psychodynamic processes involve the interplay of conscious and unconscious mental forces, new dynamic processes involve the tension between what is and what ought to be. People experience psychological tension not just from unresolved conflicts or unmet needs, but from the gap between their current reality and their sense of what their lives should mean. This tension can be either pathological, leading to despair and dysfunction, or constructive, motivating growth and achievement. The diagnostic implications of recognizing meaning as a primary motivation proved revolutionary for clinical practice. Traditional psychiatric categories focused on symptoms and dysfunctions, but Frankl identified a new category of problems he called nogenic neuroses. These are psychological disturbances that arise specifically from existential frustration rather than from psychological conflicts or biological abnormalities. A successful businessman experiencing deep depression, despite having everything he thought he wanted, might be suffering from nogenic rather than endogenous depression. The treatment implications are profound, as addressing nogenic disorders requires helping people discover meaning rather than simply alleviating symptoms. The cultural manifestations of meaning-seeking vary dramatically across societies, but the underlying drive appears universal. Anthropological research confirms that every known human culture develops meaning-making systems, whether religious, philosophical, or secular. However, what counts as meaningful differs radically between cultures, suggesting that while the need for meaning is innate, the content of meaning is learned. This creates a paradox for therapeutic intervention, as helpers must respect cultural differences in meaning content while addressing universal meaning processes. Contemporary criticism of the will-to-meaning concept centers on several sophisticated arguments. Evolutionary psychologists argue that apparent meaning-seeking behavior can be reduced to more basic survival and reproductive strategies. Self-sacrifice for abstract principles might actually serve gene propagation through kin selection or reciprocal altruism. Cognitive scientists suggest that the experience of meaning might be an epiphenomenon of pattern recognition systems that evolved to detect causal relationships in the environment. According to this view, humans find meaning in coincidences and narratives because their brains are designed to find patterns, not because they possess a distinct meaning-seeking drive. Social constructivists raise different concerns, arguing that meaning-seeking reflects internalized cultural programming rather than authentic individual motivation. People believe they are pursuing meaningful lives, but they are actually conforming to socially constructed definitions of significance that serve power structures. From this perspective, encouraging individual meaning-seeking might distract from collective action needed to address systemic problems. A worker finding personal meaning in their job might be less likely to recognize exploitation or fight for better working conditions. Empirical challenges to the will to meaning emerge from research on depression, anxiety, and motivation. Some studies suggest that people who score high on meaning in life measures are not necessarily happier or more psychologically healthy than those who score lower. Other research indicates that the pursuit of meaning can become compulsive and anxiety-provoking, leading to what researchers call meaning-making stress. Additionally, cross-cultural studies reveal that the relationship between meaning and well-being varies significantly across different societies, questioning whether meaning-seeking represents a universal human motivation or a culturally specific value. The developmental trajectory of meaning-seeking provides crucial insights into its nature and origins. Children appear to possess an innate capacity for wonder and questioning that resembles adult meaning-seeking, but their concerns focus on immediate understanding rather than life purpose. Adolescence typically marks the emergence of existential questioning as young people begin to consider their place in the larger world and their responsibilities to others. This developmental pattern suggests that while the capacity for meaning-seeking may be innate, its full expression requires cognitive and emotional maturation. Understanding this trajectory helps explain why meaning-focused interventions may be more effective with adults than with children, and why adolescent existential crises should be viewed as normal developmental challenges rather than pathological symptoms. Part 2. Meaning discovery versus meaning creation, the ontological paradox. The question of whether meaning exists independently of human consciousness or emerges through human interpretation represents one of the most profound philosophical challenges in Frankl's system. This ontological paradox shapes every aspect of therapeutic practice and personal development. If meaning exists objectively in the world, waiting to be discovered, then the therapeutic task involves helping people recognize pre-existing purposes in their circumstances. If meaning is created through human consciousness and choice, then therapy focuses on empowering people to construct their own purposes. Frankl's position navigates between these extremes through what he called the dialectical nature of meaning finding. The discovery model suggests that life situations contain inherent potential for meaning that exists independently of human awareness. A parent caring for a disabled child faces a situation that contains objective opportunities for meaning through love, sacrifice, and service. The meaning exists in the relationship and the moral demands it creates, regardless of whether the parent initially recognizes these opportunities. From this perspective, therapy involves helping people develop the perceptual sensitivity and moral imagination needed to recognize meaning that already exists in their circumstances. This approach aligns with traditional religious and philosophical perspectives that view meaning as grounded in objective reality rather than subjective interpretation. The creation model emphasizes human agency in constructing meaning through interpretation and choice. The same parent caring for a disabled child might create meaning by deciding that this experience teaches patience, deepens compassion, or demonstrates unconditional love. The meaning emerges from the parent's decision to view the situation in particular ways and to respond with specific attitudes and actions. This perspective emphasizes human freedom and creativity, while acknowledging that some interpretations prove more psychologically and socially beneficial than others. Existentialist philosophers like Sartre embraced this view, arguing that humans are condemned to freedom and must create meaning in an essentially meaningless universe. Frankl's synthesis involves what he termed the co-constitutional nature of meaning. Meaning emerges through the encounter between subjective consciousness and objective circumstances, requiring both elements but reducible to neither. The disabled child's condition creates objective demands and opportunities, but these only become meaningful through the parent's conscious recognition and response. Meaning is discovered in the sense that circumstances present real possibilities that exist independently of human wishes, but it is created in the sense that humans must consciously recognize and actualize these possibilities. This dialectical process explains why the same circumstances can be meaningful for one person and meaningless for another, while maintaining that meaning is not purely arbitrary. The therapeutic implications of this synthesis prove complex and nuanced. Therapists cannot simply tell clients what their lives mean, as this violates the creation aspect of meaning finding. But they also cannot remain completely neutral about different interpretations, as some meanings prove more psychologically healthy and socially beneficial than others. Instead, effective therapy involves what Frankl called guided discovery, helping clients recognize genuine opportunities for meaning in their circumstances while respecting their freedom to choose how to respond. This requires therapists to develop sophisticated abilities to read situations for their meaning potential, while avoiding the imposition of their own values and interpretations. The temporal dimension of meaning discovery reveals additional complexity. Meaning often emerges retrospectively, as people recognize significance in experiences that seemed meaningless when they occurred. A painful illness might become meaningful years later, when the person realizes how it deepened their empathy for others or clarified their life priorities. This retroactive meaning finding suggests that circumstances contain latent meaning potential that may not be immediately accessible to conscious awareness. It also implies that people should remain open to finding meaning in apparently meaningless experiences, as significance may emerge through reflection and changing life circumstances. Cultural relativism complicates the meaning discovery process significantly. What appears meaningful within one cultural framework may seem irrelevant or even harmful within another. A person finding meaning through individual achievement might be viewed as selfish in a collectivist culture that emphasizes family and community obligations. Conversely, someone finding meaning through self-sacrifice for family might be seen as lacking healthy boundaries in an individualistic culture that emphasizes personal development. This cultural variation raises questions about whether meaning discovery involves recognizing universal human values or learning culturally specific significance systems. Frankl argued for universal meaning structures that manifest differently across cultures while maintaining common underlying patterns. All cultures recognize some form of love as meaningful, though they define love differently and direct it toward different objects. All cultures value some form of contribution or service, though they disagree about what constitutes valuable contribution. All cultures acknowledge some form of transcendence, though they conceptualize transcendence through different religious, philosophical, or secular frameworks. This universalist position allows for cultural sensitivity while maintaining that cross-cultural dialogue about meaning remains possible and valuable. The psychological mechanisms underlying meaning discovery involve complex interactions between cognitive, emotional, and motivational systems. Cognitive processes include pattern recognition, causal attribution, and narrative construction that help people identify connections between their actions and larger purposes. Emotional processes involve the capacity for moral emotions like compassion, indignation, and inspiration that signal when experiences align with deeply held values. Motivational processes include the ability to delay gratification and persist through difficulties when pursuing long-term goals. Deficits in any of these systems can impair meaning discovery, suggesting specific therapeutic targets for helping people whose meaning-finding abilities are compromised. Contemporary neuroscience provides insights into the brain mechanisms underlying meaning discovery. Neuroimaging studies reveal that meaningful experiences activate the brain's default mode network, which is involved in self-referential thinking and moral reasoning. Meaningful activities also stimulate reward pathways in ways that differ from simple pleasure-seeking, suggesting distinct neurological substrates for meaning and hedonic enjoyment. Additionally, people who report high levels of meaning in life show different patterns of brain connectivity, particularly between regions involved in executive control and emotional processing. These findings support Frankl's contention that meaning-seeking involves unique psychological processes that cannot be reduced to other motivational systems. The paradox of meaning search reveals one of the most counterintuitive aspects of meaning discovery. People who directly pursue meaning often fail to find it, while those who engage in meaningful activities without explicit meaning, seeking often discover profound purpose. This paradox parallels the happiness paradox, in which direct pursuit of happiness typically fails, while engagement in absorbing activities often produces happiness as a byproduct. The explanation involves the self-transcendent nature of meaning, which requires attention to something beyond the self rather than introspective focus on one's own purpose. Therapeutic interventions must therefore focus on helping people engage with meaningful activities and relationships, rather than encouraging them to search for meaning directly. Part 3. The Triadic structure of meaning: creative, experiential, and attitudinal values. Frankl's identification of 3 distinct pathways to meaning provides a comprehensive framework for understanding how people can find purpose across different life circumstances and temperaments. Creative values involve what we give to the world through our actions, work, and contributions. Experiential values encompass what we receive from the world through encounters with truth, beauty, and love. Attitudinal values concern the stance we take toward unavoidable suffering and limitation. This triadic structure ensures that meaning remains accessible regardless of external circumstances, as at least one pathway typically remains available even in the most restricted situations. Creative values represent the most obvious and culturally celebrated form of meaning-making. These include artistic creation, scientific discovery, technological innovation, child-rearing, teaching, healing, and any activity that leaves the world somehow different because of our existence. The psychological satisfaction derived from creative values involves both the process of creating and the product created. A scientist finds meaning both in the excitement of discovery and in contributing knowledge that advances human understanding. A parent experiences meaning both in the daily acts of nurturing and in the long-term development of their child's character and capabilities. The temporal structure of creative meaning reveals important psychological principles. Some creative acts provide immediate meaning through the intrinsic satisfaction of the creative process itself. An artist painting or a musician performing may experience flow states that feel inherently meaningful regardless of external recognition or lasting impact. Other creative acts derive meaning from their anticipated future impact, requiring delayed gratification and sustained commitment despite immediate sacrifices. A researcher working on a decades-long project may find meaning in the vision of eventual breakthrough rather than in daily laboratory routines. Creative values face unique vulnerabilities in modern society. Technological automation threatens many traditional sources of creative meaning by replacing human labor with more efficient machines. Bureaucratic organization can fragment creative work into meaningless components, where individuals contribute small pieces to processes they don't understand or value. Mass production and consumption can devalue individual creativity by making unique contributions seem insignificant compared to large-scale industrial output. These societal changes require new approaches to accessing creative meaning, perhaps through volunteer work, artistic hobbies, or entrepreneurial ventures that restore personal agency and visible impact. Experiential values offer meaning through receptivity rather than activity, challenging cultures that emphasize doing over being. These values include encounters with natural beauty, artistic excellence, truth and love that enrich consciousness without requiring productive output. A person watching a sunset, reading a profound book, or sharing intimate conversation with a friend accesses meaning through openness to what the world offers rather than through personal achievement. This receptive dimension of meaning-making validates contemplative and aesthetic approaches to life that might otherwise seem passive or unproductive. The psychology of experiential meaning involves complex interactions between attention, emotion, and memory. Meaningful experiences typically require what psychologists call mindful attention, the ability to be fully present to immediate experience without distraction or analysis. They also involve emotional resonance, where the experience connects with deep personal values and concerns. Finally, they require integration into personal narrative, where the experience becomes part of one's ongoing life story and identity. People who struggle with any of these capacities may have difficulty accessing experiential meaning despite abundant opportunities in their environment. Cultural variations in experiential meaning reflect different aesthetic and spiritual traditions. Japanese culture emphasizes mono-no-aware, the poignant awareness of the impermanence of all things, which finds meaning in fleeting beauty. Western romantic tradition celebrates passionate love as a supreme experiential value, while Buddhist tradition might emphasize compassionate awareness. Indigenous cultures often find experiential meaning through connection with natural environments and ancestral wisdom. These cultural differences suggest that while the capacity for experiential meaning appears universal, its specific expressions require cultural learning and community support. Attitudinal values represent Frankl's most controversial and profound contribution to meaning theory. When circumstances eliminate possibilities for creative action and limit opportunities for meaningful experience, people can still find meaning through the attitude they take toward their situation. This is not passive acceptance or resigned submission, but active choice about how to face unavoidable difficulties. A person facing terminal illness cannot choose to avoid death, but can choose dignity over despair, courage over cowardice, or love over bitterness. These choices transform suffering from mere pain into moral achievement and spiritual growth. The phenomenology of attitudinal meaning differs qualitatively from creative and experiential meaning. Creative meaning typically involves satisfaction from accomplishment, and experiential meaning involves joy or wonder from beautiful encounters. Attitudinal meaning often involves what Frankl called tragic optimism, a form of meaning that emerges precisely through facing limitations and difficulties with courage and dignity. This meaning may feel solemn rather than joyful, profound rather than satisfying, but it can be equally powerful in sustaining psychological resilience and sense of purpose. The moral dimensions of attitudinal values raise complex ethical questions. Frankl argued that some attitudes towards suffering are objectively better than others, implying moral standards that transcend individual preference. Choosing courage over cowardice or love over hatred represents genuine moral achievement, not merely different lifestyle choices. This position conflicts with moral relativism, but aligns with virtue ethics, traditions that identify character traits as objectively valuable. However, determining which attitudes constitute moral achievement requires careful consideration of circumstances, cultural context, and individual capabilities. The therapeutic applications of attitudinal values prove particularly challenging because they require helping people find meaning in situations that seem inherently meaningless. A therapist working with someone facing chronic illness cannot eliminate the illness, but can help the person discover how their response to illness might express important values. This requires exceptional sensitivity to avoid suggesting that suffering is good in itself, or that people should accept preventable problems. The goal is not to encourage passive acceptance, but to help people recognize opportunities for moral and spiritual growth within unavoidable limitations. Contemporary criticism of attitudinal values centers on concerns about victim blaming and political passivity. Critics argue that encouraging people to find meaning in suffering might discourage them from working to eliminate preventable suffering in society. Emphasis on individual attitude change might distract from collective action needed to address systemic injustice and social problems. Additionally, suggesting that people can choose their attitude toward trauma might blame those who struggle with post-traumatic stress or depression for not having the right attitude. These concerns require careful distinction between advocating for attitudinal meaning as a supplement to, rather than substitute for, social action and trauma treatment. The hierarchy and interaction among the three value types reveals sophisticated psychological dynamics. Frankl argued that people typically prefer creative values when available, fall back on experiential values when action is limited, and resort to attitudinal values only when other options are exhausted. However, this hierarchy can shift based on temperament, life stage, and cultural background. Some contemplative personalities may naturally prefer experiential values, while others may find their greatest meaning through attitudinal responses to challenge. Understanding these individual differences helps therapists and educators match meaning-making approaches to personal strengths and circumstances. Part 4. Freedom and Responsibility. The existential space between stimulus and response. The concept of existential freedom forms the cornerstone of Frankl's anthropological vision, distinguishing his approach from both deterministic and libertarian extremes. This freedom is not the absence of constraints or the ability to do whatever one wants, but rather the space for choice that exists between external circumstances and human response. Even in the most restrictive situations, people retain some degree of freedom in how they interpret and respond to their circumstances. This internal freedom cannot be taken away by external force, though it can be abdicated through unconscious habit or conscious surrender. Understanding and exercising this freedom becomes both the foundation of psychological health and the basis of human dignity. The neurobiological basis of existential freedom involves complex interactions between brain systems responsible for automatic responses and those involved in conscious reflection. The limbic system generates immediate emotional and behavioral responses to environmental stimuli, while the prefrontal cortex enables reflection, planning, and value-based decision-making. The space between stimulus and response literally exists in the neural pathways that connect these systems. When people act impulsively, they bypass the prefrontal cortex and respond directly from limbic activation. When they exercise existential freedom, they engage prefrontal systems that can modulate automatic responses based on conscious values and long-term goals. The development of existential freedom requires both neurological maturation and psychological learning. Children possess limited capacity for existential freedom because their prefrontal cortex continues developing until their mid-20s. Even adults may have underdeveloped capacity for existential freedom if they experience trauma, neglect, or environments that discouraged reflection and choice. However, neuroplasticity research suggests that the capacity for existential freedom can be enhanced through practices like meditation, therapy, and deliberate reflection on values and choices. This developmental perspective emphasizes that freedom is not simply given, but must be cultivated through conscious effort and supportive environments. The relationship between freedom and determinism in Frankl's system avoids both naive free will beliefs and reductive determinism. Human behavior is indeed influenced by genetics, unconscious processes, social conditioning, and environmental factors. However, these influences create tendencies rather than absolute compulsions, leaving space for conscious choice even within significant constraints. A person with genetic predisposition to depression may be more likely to experience depressive episodes, but they retain some choice about how to respond to depressive thoughts and feelings. This position, sometimes called compatibilism, maintains that freedom and causation can coexist without contradiction. The phenomenology of existential choice reveals distinct experiential qualities that distinguish it from other forms of decision-making. Routine choices involve selecting among options based on established preferences and habits. Strategic choices involve calculating costs and benefits to achieve desired outcomes. Existential choices involve decisions about who to become and what values to embody, often in situations where no clear guidelines exist. These choices feel weightier and more personally defining because they express fundamental commitments about the kind of person one wants to be. The anxiety associated with existential freedom provides crucial insights into human psychology. Kierkegaard described anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, the vertigo people experience when confronting the full scope of their choices and their responsibility for the consequences. This existential anxiety differs from fear, which has a specific object, and from pathological anxiety, which is disproportionate to realistic threats. Existential anxiety is appropriate to the human condition and signals the weight of genuine choice and responsibility. People who never experience existential anxiety may be avoiding the full recognition of their freedom and responsibility. The escape from freedom represents a pervasive psychological phenomenon that Frankl observed across different contexts. When people feel overwhelmed by the burden of choice and responsibility, they may unconsciously surrender their freedom through various mechanisms. Some people escape into conformity, automatically adopting the values and behaviors of their social group without reflection. Others escape into compulsion, developing rigid behavioral patterns that eliminate the need for ongoing choice. Still others escape into victimhood, defining themselves primarily through their suffering rather than their capacity for response. The therapeutic implications of existential freedom require careful balance between acknowledging constraints and emphasizing choice. Clients often enter therapy feeling powerless and overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. Simply telling them they have freedom to choose their response may seem insensitive to real limitations and trauma. Effective therapy involves gradually helping clients recognize areas where they do have choice, while validating the reality of their constraints. This process often begins with very small choices and gradually expands to encompass larger decisions about values, relationships, and life direction. The social dimensions of existential freedom reveal complex interactions between individual choice and collective influence. People exercise their freedom within social contexts that shape the range of available options and the meanings attributed to different choices. A person born into poverty faces different constraints and opportunities than someone born into wealth, affecting the practical expression of their existential freedom. However, Frankl argued that external circumstances never completely determine internal responses, and that recognizing this remaining freedom becomes crucial for maintaining dignity and hope. This perspective validates both individual agency and social justice concerns without reducing either to the other. Responsibility emerges as the inevitable corollary of existential freedom. If people have genuine choice in how they respond to circumstances, then they bear responsibility for the consequences of their choices. This responsibility extends beyond legal or social accountability to include what Frankl called ontological responsibility, the obligation to actualize one's potential and fulfill one's unique possibilities. Every person has talents, opportunities, and circumstances that create specific demands and possibilities that only they can fulfill. Recognizing and responding to these unique demands becomes both a privilege and an obligation of human existence. The scope of human responsibility raises complex questions about individual versus collective obligation. Frankl emphasized that people are responsible to life for their lives, suggesting accountability to something beyond personal preference or social convention. This might involve responsibility to future generations, to moral principles, to God, or to the intrinsic value of human existence itself. However, determining the specific content of this responsibility requires ongoing dialogue between individuals and their communities, as isolated individuals cannot discern their obligations without reference to shared values and collective wisdom. This social dimension of responsibility prevents existential freedom from becoming solipsistic self-indulgence. The pathology of responsibility manifests in both excessive and insufficient forms. Some people develop pathological guilt and shame, taking responsibility for events and outcomes beyond their actual control. Others develop pathological irresponsibility, refusing to acknowledge their genuine influence and obligation. Healthy responsibility involves accurate assessment of one's actual sphere of influence and the appropriate acceptance of accountability within that sphere. This requires both self-knowledge and reality testing, as people often misjudge either their limitations or their capabilities. Contemporary challenges to existential freedom emerge from advances in neuroscience, genetics, and social psychology that reveal the extent of unconscious and environmental influences on behavior. Brain imaging shows that many decisions appear to be made unconsciously before people become aware of them, challenging the experience of conscious choice. Genetic research identifies hereditary influences on personality, intelligence, and mental health that significantly shape life outcomes. Social psychology demonstrates how situational factors can override individual values and intentions in determining behavior. These findings require sophisticated integration with existential freedom concepts to maintain both scientific accuracy and humanistic values. Part 5. Tragic Optimism and the Transformation of Suffering. Tragic optimism represents Frankl's most sophisticated attempt to address the problem of suffering without falling into either naive optimism or cynical pessimism. This concept acknowledges the inevitable presence of what he called the tragic triad: suffering, guilt, and death. These are not unfortunate accidents or failures of human existence, but rather fundamental aspects of the human condition that cannot be eliminated through progress, therapy, or spiritual development. Tragic optimism maintains hope and meaning-making capacity while fully accepting these tragic realities. This position requires a mature psychological stance that can hold both darkness and light without denying either or collapsing into despair. The psychological architecture of tragic optimism involves complex cognitive and emotional processes that enable people to maintain forward-looking engagement despite acknowledging limitation and loss. Cognitively, it requires what psychologists call dialectical thinking, the ability to hold contradictory truths simultaneously without rushing to resolve the tension. Emotionally, it involves developing tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty while maintaining connection to values and purposes. Behaviorally, it manifests as continued commitment to meaningful action despite recognition that all achievements are temporary and incomplete. This psychological stance develops gradually through experience and reflection, rather than being achieved through intellectual understanding alone. Suffering, the first element of the tragic triad, receives Frankl's most detailed analysis because it represents the most universal and immediate challenge to meaning-making. He distinguished between necessary and unnecessary suffering, arguing that while some pain is unavoidable, much human suffering results from resistance to reality or poor choices. Necessary suffering includes physical illness, loss of loved ones, aging, and other experiences inherent to embodied existence. Unnecessary suffering includes the additional pain people create through denial, resentment, self-pity, or destructive behaviors. Tragic optimism focuses on transforming necessary suffering into meaning while working to eliminate unnecessary suffering through wisdom and choice. The phenomenology of transformed suffering reveals specific psychological processes that convert pain into meaning. First, suffering must be accepted rather than denied or rationalized away, as authentic meaning-making requires honest engagement with reality. Second, the suffering must be contextualized within larger frameworks of value and purpose that give it significance beyond mere pain. Third, the person must discover ways to grow, serve, or witness through their suffering that would not have been possible without it. Finally, the transformed suffering must be integrated into personal narrative in ways that enhance rather than diminish overall life meaning. Guilt, the second element of the tragic triad, poses particular challenges for meaning-making because it involves recognition of personal responsibility for harm or failure. Frankl distinguished between neurotic guilt, which is disproportionate or irrational, and existential guilt, which appropriately acknowledges genuine moral failure. Existential guilt cannot be eliminated through forgiveness or therapy alone, but requires what he called responsible action to address the consequences of past mistakes. This might involve making amends, changing behavior patterns, or dedicating oneself to causes that counteract previous harm. Tragic optimism maintains that even serious moral failures can become sources of wisdom, compassion, and commitment that enhance rather than diminish overall life meaning. The psychology of guilt transformation involves complex processes of moral learning and character development. Initial guilt typically involves shame, self-condemnation, and desire to hide from the consequences of one's actions. Healthy guilt processing requires moving beyond shame toward responsibility, focusing on repair rather than self-punishment. This transition often involves what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, where people develop enhanced empathy, clearer values, and stronger commitment to ethical behavior through facing their failures. However, this growth requires supportive relationships and meaning-making frameworks that can hold both accountability and compassion. Death, the final element of the tragic triad, provides perhaps the strongest challenge to meaning-making because it represents the ultimate limitation of human existence. Awareness of mortality can either paralyze people with anxiety about meaninglessness or motivate them toward more authentic and urgent engagement with life. Frankl argued that death gives life its preciousness and urgency, making choices matter precisely because time is limited. Without the reality of death, people might procrastinate indefinitely, rather than committing to particular values and relationships. Tragic optimism embraces mortality as the condition that makes meaning possible, rather than the threat that makes meaning impossible. The cultural variations in approaches to the tragic triad reveal different wisdom traditions for managing human limitation. Eastern philosophies often emphasize acceptance and detachment as ways of transcending suffering, while Western traditions may emphasize action and transformation. Some religious traditions focus on ultimate redemption of suffering through divine intervention, while secular approaches emphasize human agency in creating meaning despite limitation. Indigenous cultures often emphasize connection to natural cycles and ancestral wisdom as sources of resilience in facing tragedy. These cultural differences suggest multiple valid approaches to tragic optimism while maintaining universal human need to address suffering, guilt, and death. The therapeutic applications of tragic optimism require exceptional skill and sensitivity because they involve helping people find meaning in experiences they would prefer to avoid. Therapists must validate clients' pain and loss while gradually introducing possibilities for growth and meaning without minimizing the reality of their suffering. This requires what Frankl called the art of living, the ability to navigate between false consolation and hopeless despair. Effective interventions often involve helping clients identify ways their suffering has deepened their compassion, clarified their values, or prepared them to help others facing similar challenges. However, these interventions must be carefully timed and sensitively delivered to avoid re-traumatization or premature meaning-making. Contemporary challenges to tragic optimism emerge from cultural trends toward pain avoidance and technological solutions to human problems. Modern society often promotes the belief that suffering is always pathological and should be eliminated through medical, psychological, or technological intervention. While this approach successfully reduces much unnecessary suffering, it may also diminish people's capacity to find meaning in unavoidable difficulties. Social media and consumer culture often promote unrealistic expectations of continuous happiness and success, making the tragic triad seem like personal failures rather than universal human experiences. Maintaining tragic optimism in such contexts requires countercultural commitment to mature psychological development and realistic expectations about human existence. The relationship between tragic optimism and post-traumatic growth reveals important connections between Frankl's insights and contemporary psychological research. Studies consistently show that many people report positive changes following traumatic experiences, including enhanced appreciation for life, deeper relationships, increased personal strength, and clarified priorities. However, not everyone experiences post-traumatic growth, and growth often coexists with ongoing distress rather than replacing it. Understanding the conditions that promote growth, while respecting individual differences in response to trauma, requires integration of tragic optimism principles with evidence-based therapeutic approaches. This integration supports both meaning-making and symptom reduction without forcing premature optimism or denying legitimate suffering. Part 6. Logotherapy, Clinical Applications and Therapeutic Techniques. Logotherapy represents Frankl's systematic application of meaning-centered principles to psychological healing and personal development. Unlike psychoanalysis, which focuses on unconscious conflicts, or cognitive therapy, which targets dysfunctional thinking patterns, logotherapy addresses what Frankl termed the noological dimension of human existence. This approach assumes that many psychological problems stem from existential frustration rather than psychological pathology, requiring interventions that help people discover meaning rather than simply alleviating symptoms. The therapeutic relationship becomes a collaborative exploration of meaning possibilities rather than an expert diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. This paradigm shift requires fundamental changes in how therapists understand both human nature and the healing process. The diagnostic framework of logotherapy introduces the concept of noogenic neuroses, psychological disturbances that arise specifically from meaning deficits rather than psychological conflicts or biological abnormalities. These conditions manifest as existential vacuum, spiritual distress, and value conflicts that cannot be resolved through traditional therapeutic approaches. A successful professional experiencing depression, despite apparent life satisfaction, may be suffering from noogenic rather than endogenous depression. The symptoms appear similar, but the underlying cause involves meaning deficits that require existential rather than pharmacological intervention. Accurate diagnosis becomes crucial because inappropriate treatment approaches may worsen noogenic conditions by addressing symptoms while ignoring underlying meaning needs. Paradoxical intention, one of logotherapy's most distinctive techniques, involves encouraging clients to consciously pursue or exaggerate the very symptoms they want to eliminate. Someone with insomnia might be instructed to stay awake as long as possible, while a person with social anxiety might be told to deliberately appear nervous in social situations. This technique works by interrupting the cycle of anticipatory anxiety that maintains many psychological symptoms. When people stop fighting their symptoms and instead embrace them paradoxically, they often discover that the symptoms lose their power and intensity. The technique requires careful application and thorough explanation to prevent clients from feeling that their concerns are being minimized or ridiculed. The psychological mechanisms underlying paradoxical intention involve complex interactions between conscious intention and automatic response systems. Many psychological symptoms are maintained by what psychologists call the ironic process theory, where attempts to suppress unwanted thoughts or feelings actually increase their frequency and intensity. Paradoxical intention breaks this cycle by removing the element of struggle and resistance that often fuels symptomatic behavior. Additionally, the technique mobilizes what Frankl called the defiant power of the human spirit, the capacity to take a stance toward one's own psychological processes rather than being completely identified with them. This creates psychological distance that enables more flexible and adaptive responses to difficult internal experiences. Dereflection, the second major logotherapy technique, addresses problems that arise from excessive self-focus and introspection. Many psychological difficulties are exacerbated by hypervigilance about symptoms, performance, or emotional states. Someone struggling with sexual dysfunction may become so focused on their performance that they cannot relax into natural responsiveness. A person worried about happiness may become so preoccupied with monitoring their mood that they miss opportunities for enjoyable experiences. Dereflection helps clients redirect attention away from problematic self-focus toward engaging activities and meaningful relationships. The technique of dereflection operates through what Frankl called the self-transcendent nature of human existence. People find fulfillment not by focusing inward on their own needs and desires, but by reaching outward towards something or someone beyond themselves. This might involve dedicating oneself to a worthy cause, developing a loving relationship, or pursuing truth and beauty. The self finds itself by losing itself in meaningful engagement, while direct pursuit of self-fulfillment often leads to frustration and emptiness. Therapeutic interventions therefore focus on helping clients identify and engage with meaningful activities rather than encouraging introspection and self-analysis. Attitude modification represents a third category of logotherapy interventions that help clients develop more adaptive responses to unchangeable circumstances. Unlike cognitive therapy, which focuses on changing thought content, attitude modification addresses the fundamental stance people take toward their life situations. A person facing chronic illness cannot change their medical condition, but they can modify their attitude toward the illness in ways that preserve dignity and create meaning. This might involve viewing the illness as an opportunity to develop patience, deepen relationships, or demonstrate courage rather than simply as an unfortunate burden. Attitude modification requires careful attention to timing and client readiness, as premature intervention may seem invalidating or insensitive. The process of values clarification forms a central component of logotherapy that helps clients identify their deepest commitments and organize their lives around meaningful priorities. Many people experience distress because they have never clearly identified what matters most to them, or because their daily activities conflict with their core values. Values clarification involves systematic exploration of what the client finds genuinely meaningful rather than what they think they should value or what others expect them to value. This process often reveals conflicts between authentic values and social expectations that require careful navigation and sometimes difficult choices. The goal is not to impose particular values, but to help clients discover and commit to their own authentic value systems. Meaning-making interventions in logotherapy focus on helping clients recognize opportunities for purpose and significance in their current circumstances. Rather than waiting for ideal conditions or major life changes, people can often find meaning in small, daily choices and interactions. A parent caring for young children might discover meaning in modeling patience and kindness, while a student struggling with difficult coursework might find purpose in developing discipline and perseverance. These interventions require therapists to develop sensitivity to the unique meaning potential present in each client's specific situation, while avoiding the imposition of their own meaning interpretations. The collaborative nature of this process respects client autonomy while providing gentle guidance toward meaning recognition. The therapeutic relationship in logotherapy differs significantly from other therapeutic modalities through its emphasis on encounter rather than technique. Frankl argued that genuine healing occurs through authentic human meeting between therapist and client rather than through the application of specific interventions. The therapist must be willing to be personally present and vulnerable rather than hiding behind professional roles and procedures. This requires therapists to have done their own meaning-making work and to be comfortable with existential questions and uncertainties. The relationship becomes a laboratory for exploring meaning, values, and authentic selfhood within the safety of therapeutic boundaries. Contemporary integration of logotherapy with other therapeutic approaches reveals both opportunities and challenges for meaning-centered intervention. Many modern therapies incorporate elements of meaning-making and values work, suggesting broad recognition of these concepts' importance. However, superficial adoption of logotherapy techniques without understanding their philosophical foundations may dilute their effectiveness. Effective integration requires therapists to appreciate the existential dimension of human experience while maintaining competence in addressing psychological symptoms and behavioral problems. This integration becomes particularly important when working with clients who present both meaning deficits and traditional mental health symptoms requiring comprehensive treatment approaches. Part 7. The Dimensional Ontology of Human Existence. Frankl's dimensional anthropology provides a sophisticated framework for understanding human nature that avoids both reductionist materialism and naive spiritualism. This model suggests that humans exist simultaneously on three distinct but interconnected dimensions: the somatic, psychological, and noological. Each dimension has its own characteristics, processes, and pathologies, but they interact dynamically to create the unified experience of human existence. Understanding these dimensions and their interactions becomes crucial for accurate assessment of human problems and appropriate intervention strategies. This multidimensional view challenges therapeutic approaches that focus exclusively on one dimension while ignoring the others. The somatic dimension encompasses all biological and physiological aspects of human existence, including genetics, neurobiology, hormones, and physical health. This dimension operates according to natural laws and scientific principles that can be studied through empirical research and medical investigation. Somatic problems include physical illness, genetic disorders, brain injuries, and chemical imbalances that affect psychological functioning. Traditional medical approaches excel at addressing somatic dimension problems through pharmaceutical intervention, surgery, and other biological treatments. However, exclusive focus on the somatic dimension reduces human beings to complex biological machines, missing their psychological and spiritual capacities. The psychological dimension includes emotions, thoughts, memories, learning patterns, and personality characteristics that develop through experience and social interaction. This dimension operates according to psychological principles involving conditioning, cognition, attachment, and developmental processes. Psychological problems include depression, anxiety, trauma responses, and maladaptive behavior patterns that can be addressed through various forms of psychotherapy. Traditional psychological approaches excel at understanding and treating problems in this dimension through techniques like cognitive restructuring, exposure therapy, and relationship healing. However, exclusive focus on the psychological dimension misses both biological influences and spiritual capacities that affect human experience. The noological dimension represents Frankl's unique contribution to anthropological understanding. encompassing human capacities for meaning, values, responsibility, and self-transcendence. This dimension operates according to spiritual principles involving choice, meaning-making, and moral responsibility that cannot be reduced to biological or psychological processes. Noological problems include existential vacuum, value conflicts, and spiritual distress that require meaning-centered rather than medical or psychological intervention. Logotherapy specifically addresses noological dimension problems through techniques like values clarification, meaning exploration, and attitude modification. This dimension makes humans uniquely human, distinguishing them from other animals through their capacity for self-transcendence and moral choice. The interaction between dimensions reveals complex patterns of influence that challenge simple linear causation models. Somatic factors can influence psychological and noological functioning, as seen when depression results from thyroid disorders or when brain injuries affect personality and values. Psychological factors can influence somatic and noological functioning, as demonstrated by psychosomatic illness or when traumatic experiences affect spiritual beliefs. Noological factors can influence somatic and psychological functioning, as shown when strong life purpose enhances immune function or when value conflicts create anxiety symptoms. Understanding these multidirectional influences enables more comprehensive assessment and treatment of human problems. The diagnostic implications of dimensional ontology require sophisticated differential assessment to determine which dimension primarily underlies presenting problems. Someone experiencing depression might have somatic depression requiring medication, psychological depression requiring therapy, or noological depression requiring meaning intervention. Accurate diagnosis involves systematic evaluation of all three dimensions, rather than assuming that symptoms reflect problems in one particular area. This comprehensive assessment prevents misdiagnosis and inappropriate treatment that might address symptoms in one dimension while ignoring underlying causes in another. The assessment process itself can be therapeutic by helping clients understand the multidimensional nature of their experience. The therapeutic implications of dimensional ontology suggest that effective treatment often requires addressing multiple dimensions simultaneously rather than focusing exclusively on one area. Someone with trauma-related depression might need medical treatment for neurochemical imbalances, psychological therapy for traumatic memories, and meaning-centered intervention for spiritual distress. Coordinating treatment across dimensions requires collaboration between medical professionals, psychotherapists, and spiritual counselors who understand their respective roles and limitations. This multidisciplinary approach becomes particularly important for complex cases involving multiple contributing factors across different dimensions. The integration challenge involves maintaining focus on the whole person while addressing specific dimensional problems effectively. The philosophical implications of dimensional ontology challenge both materialist reductionism and religious dualism through a sophisticated understanding of human nature. Against materialist reductionism, the model insists that human spiritual capacities cannot be reduced to biological or psychological processes without losing something essential. Against religious dualism, the model maintains that spiritual, psychological, and somatic dimensions are unified in one integrated human existence rather than separate substances. This position, sometimes called emergent dualism, suggests that higher-order capacities emerge from but cannot be reduced to lower-order processes. The philosophical sophistication of this position enables dialogue between scientific and religious worldviews without requiring either to abandon their distinctive insights. The research implications of dimensional ontology suggest the need for multidisciplinary approaches to understanding human nature and developing effective interventions. Traditional research methods may be adequate for studying somatic and psychological dimensions, but inadequate for investigating noological phenomena. Spiritual capacities like meaning-making and self-transcendence may require qualitative, phenomenological or participatory research methods that honor their subjective and values-laden character. This methodological diversity creates challenges for integrated research programs, but may be necessary for comprehensive understanding of human experience. The challenge involves maintaining scientific rigor while remaining open to phenomena that cannot be captured through purely empirical methods. Contemporary neuroscience provides interesting support for dimensional ontology through research on brain plasticity and top-down causation. Studies show that psychological interventions, like therapy, can produce measurable changes in brain structure and function, suggesting that higher-order processes can influence lower-order ones. Research on meditation and contemplative practices demonstrates that spiritual practices can affect both psychological well-being and physical health. These findings support Frankl's contention that dimensions interact dynamically rather than functioning independently. However, neuroscientific research also raises questions about whether noological phenomena require non-physical explanations or whether they can be understood as emergent properties of complex brain systems. The cultural variations in dimensional emphasis reveal different anthropological traditions and their implications for understanding human nature. Western medical culture tends to emphasize the somatic dimension, while Western psychological culture focuses on the psychological dimension. Eastern traditions often emphasize spiritual development, while indigenous cultures may integrate all dimensions within holistic worldviews. These cultural differences affect how people understand their problems and what types of solutions they find acceptable and effective. Cross-cultural competence in dimensional assessment requires understanding how different cultures conceptualize the relationship between body, mind, and spirit without imposing one cultural framework on people from different backgrounds. Part 8. Concentration Camp Psychology, Laboratory of Human Nature. Frankl's concentration camp experiences provided an unparalleled laboratory for observing human nature under extreme conditions, yielding insights that fundamentally challenged existing psychological theories. The camps created controlled conditions where normal social supports, material comforts, and future planning were systematically eliminated. In this environment, individual differences in psychological resilience became starkly apparent, allowing Frankl to observe which factors distinguished those who maintained their humanity from those who collapsed into despair or brutality. These observations occurred not through academic study but through personal participation in extreme suffering while maintaining scientific curiosity about human responses to dehumanization. The unique combination of subjective experience and objective observation produced insights unavailable through normal research methods. The initial phase of camp experience involved what Frankl termed the shock of admission, during which new prisoners confronted the reality of their situation and began psychological adaptation processes. Many prisoners initially responded with disbelief, hoping that conditions would improve or that liberation would come quickly. This phase involved what psychologists now recognize as cognitive dissonance, where people struggle to integrate new information that contradicts their existing worldview. Some prisoners adapted quickly by abandoning hope and accepting their situation, while others maintained hope through various psychological mechanisms, including fantasy, denial, and spiritual faith. Frankl observed that neither complete despair nor naive optimism proved most adaptive, but rather a form of tragic optimism that acknowledged reality while maintaining commitment to human values. The second phase involved psychological adaptation to camp routine, during which prisoners developed various coping strategies and established new social relationships within the constrained environment. Frankl observed that prisoners who maintained focus on something beyond immediate survival tended to show greater psychological resilience than those who became completely absorbed in moment-to-moment existence. Some prisoners found meaning through mental activities like composing poetry, solving mathematical problems, or conducting philosophical discussions. Others found meaning through interpersonal connections, sharing food, offering comfort, or maintaining dignity despite dehumanizing conditions. Still others found meaning through spiritual practices, prayer, or commitment to moral principles, even when such commitments offered no practical benefit. The phenomenon of psychological death became apparent among prisoners who gave up hope and abandoned efforts to maintain their humanity. These individuals, whom other prisoners called Muslims, showed characteristic signs of psychological collapse, including loss of interest in appearance, food, and social connection. Frankl observed that psychological death often preceded physical death by weeks or months, suggesting that the will to live involves more than simple biological survival instincts. Prisoners who experienced psychological death often had adequate physical health, but had lost any sense of purpose or meaning that could sustain motivation to continue living. This observation supported Frankl's developing theory that meaning represents a fundamental human need rather than a luxury available only in comfortable circumstances. The role of future orientation proved crucial in determining psychological survival, as prisoners who maintained connection to future possibilities showed greater resilience than those who became trapped in present suffering. Some prisoners sustained hope through thoughts of reuniting with loved ones, completing unfinished work, or witnessing justice for their oppressors. Frankl himself maintained psychological stability, partly through his commitment to reconstructing a manuscript about logotherapy that had been confiscated during his arrest. However, maintaining future orientation required constant psychological work, as camp conditions systematically undermined planning and hope through arbitrary violence and unpredictable survival. The most resilient prisoners developed what might be called tragic hope, maintaining future orientation while accepting uncertainty about whether they would survive to see their hopes fulfilled. The moral dimensions of camp psychology revealed complex relationships between survival and ethical behavior that challenged simple moral categories. Prisoners faced constant moral dilemmas involving choices between self-preservation and helping others, honesty and survival-enhancing deception, and individual versus collective welfare. Frankl observed that maintaining moral integrity often enhanced rather than threatened survival by preserving psychological coherence and social connections that provided practical benefits. However, rigid moral principles could also become maladaptive when circumstances required flexible responses to unprecedented situations. The most psychologically resilient prisoners seemed to maintain core moral commitments while adapting their specific behaviors to survival requirements without losing their essential humanity. The phenomenon of moral regression affected some prisoners who responded to dehumanization by adopting the values and behaviors of their oppressors. These individuals, often called capos when they gained positions of authority, showed how extreme circumstances could corrupt character and transform victims into perpetrators. Frankl observed that moral regression typically involved abandoning higher-order values like compassion and justice while retaining focus on immediate survival and power. However, he also noted that some prisoners in positions of authority used their power to help others, demonstrating that circumstances alone did not determine moral choices. This observation supported his later emphasis on human freedom and responsibility, even within extreme constraints. The role of small freedoms became apparent as prisoners discovered meaning and maintained dignity through tiny choices that seemed insignificant to outside observers. A prisoner might choose to share their last piece of bread, maintain personal hygiene despite practical futility, or refuse to participate in humiliating activities even at personal cost. These small acts of choice provided crucial psychological benefits by affirming personal agency and moral identity, despite overwhelming powerlessness. Frankl observed that prisoners who exercised these small freedoms consistently showed greater psychological resilience than those who abandoned all sense of choice and responsibility. This observation formed the foundation for his later emphasis on the space between stimulus and response where human freedom operates. The liberation phase revealed unexpected psychological challenges as survivors confronted the reality of freedom after extended periods of extreme constraint. Many survivors experienced what Frankl termed depersonalization, feeling emotionally numb and unable to experience joy despite their liberation. Others struggled with survivor guilt, questioning why they had lived while others had died and whether they deserved their survival. Some survivors found that their pre-war values and relationships no longer felt meaningful after their extreme experiences, requiring extensive psychological reconstruction. These liberation challenges demonstrated that trauma recovery involves more than simply removing external stressors and requires active meaning-making and identity reconstruction. The implications of camp psychology for understanding normal human functioning proved profound and far-reaching. The extreme conditions revealed psychological capacities and vulnerabilities that might remain hidden under normal circumstances. People who seemed strong and stable in ordinary life sometimes collapsed quickly under extreme stress, while others who appeared fragile showed unexpected resilience. These observations suggested that psychological assessment based on normal functioning might miss crucial aspects of human nature that emerge only under extreme conditions. Understanding human potential requires consideration of how people respond not only to comfortable circumstances but also to meaningful challenges and genuine suffering. Contemporary relevance of camp psychology extends to understanding resilience in various extreme situations, including natural disasters, political oppression, serious illness, and personal trauma. Frankl's observations about the role of meaning, future orientation, small freedoms, and moral integrity apply broadly to situations where people face overwhelming circumstances beyond their control. However, applying these insights requires careful attention to cultural context and individual differences rather than assuming universal responses to extreme stress. The camp experience also raises important questions about the limits of human adaptability and the conditions under which meaning-making becomes impossible or inappropriate. These considerations prevent simplistic application of camp insights while preserving their essential wisdom about human nature and resilience. Part 9. The Existential Vacuum, Modern Meaninglessness and its Manifestations. The existential vacuum represents Frankl's analysis of a distinctly modern form of psychological distress that emerges from prosperity rather than adversity. Unlike traditional psychological problems that arise from trauma, conflict, or deprivation, the existential vacuum develops when people achieve material security, but lack a sense of purpose or direction. This condition manifests as chronic boredom, apathy, and a persistent feeling that life lacks meaning despite external success and comfort. The vacuum is not simply the absence of meaning, but an active emptiness that creates its own form of suffering and drives people toward compensatory behaviors that often exacerbate rather than resolve their underlying distress. Understanding this condition requires examining both its social origins and its individual manifestations across different cultural contexts. The historical emergence of existential vacuum correlates with specific social and cultural developments that have undermined traditional sources of meaning while failing to provide adequate replacements. Traditional societies provided meaning through clear social roles, religious frameworks, and cultural narratives that answered fundamental questions about life purpose and human obligation. Modern secular societies have challenged these traditional frameworks through scientific materialism, cultural pluralism, and individual autonomy, without developing equally compelling alternatives. The result is unprecedented freedom to choose one's own meaning combined with unprecedented confusion about how to make such choices responsibly and effectively. This freedom becomes a burden for people who lack the psychological resources or cultural support needed for effective meaning-making. The psychological manifestations of existential vacuum differ from clinical depression and anxiety in subtle but important ways that require careful diagnostic discrimination. While depression typically involves sadness, hopelessness, and loss of interest in previously enjoyed activities, existential vacuum involves emotional numbness and the absence of any activities that feel genuinely engaging. While anxiety involves fear about specific threats or general uncertainty, existential vacuum involves a peculiar form of restlessness that cannot be relieved by addressing external circumstances. People experiencing existential vacuum often report feeling that they are going through the motions of life without any real investment in outcomes or experiences. This emotional flatness can be mistaken for depression, but responds differently to therapeutic intervention and requires meaning-focused rather than symptom-focused treatment. The behavioral manifestations of existential vacuum reveal systematic patterns of meaning-seeking gone awry. Some people attempt to fill the vacuum through what Frankl called the conformist response, automatically adopting the values and lifestyles promoted by their social environment without reflection or genuine commitment. Others pursue the totalitarian response, becoming fanatically devoted to political, religious, or ideological movements that provide artificial sense of purpose through identification with external authorities. Still others engage in various forms of addiction, compulsive consumption, or thrill-seeking behavior that provide temporary relief from emptiness without addressing underlying meaning deficits. These compensatory behaviors often create additional problems that compound rather than resolve the original existential distress. The consumer culture provides particularly fertile ground for existential vacuum development through its systematic redefinition of human fulfillment in terms of material acquisition and hedonic pleasure. Marketing messages consistently promise that happiness, identity, and meaning can be purchased through specific products, experiences, or lifestyle choices. This cultural programming trains people to look outside themselves for meaning, while undermining their capacity for the internal reflection and value clarification needed for authentic meaning-making. The constant stimulation provided by digital media and consumer culture can mask existential vacuum symptoms while preventing the quiet reflection needed for meaning discovery. People may stay busy enough to avoid confronting their emptiness while never engaging in activities that provide genuine fulfillment. The social media phenomenon represents a particularly modern manifestation of existential vacuum through its provision of artificial meaning substitutes that simulate genuine purpose without providing authentic fulfillment. Social media platforms provide constant opportunities for external validation through likes, shares, and comments that can temporarily relieve feelings of meaninglessness. However, this external validation becomes addictive precisely because it cannot address the internal emptiness that drives the need for constant affirmation. Additionally, social media comparison culture can exacerbate existential vacuum by suggesting that others have discovered meaningful lives while one remains confused and directionless. The curated nature of social media presentations creates unrealistic expectations about how meaningful lives should appear from the outside. The workplace manifestations of existential vacuum have become increasingly apparent as modern employment conditions often fail to provide intrinsic meaning despite offering material rewards. Many jobs require repetitive tasks that contribute to processes too large and complex for individual workers to understand or value. Corporate cultures often emphasize efficiency and profit maximization in ways that conflict with workers' desire for purpose and human connection. The gig economy and frequent job changes can prevent the deep engagement and skill development that provide natural sources of meaning through mastery and contribution. Burnout often represents not just overwork, but the exhaustion that results from sustained effort in activities that feel meaningless or morally questionable. The educational system's role in either preventing or promoting existential vacuum depends on whether it helps students develop meaning-making capacities or simply prepares them for economic productivity. Educational approaches that emphasize memorization, standardized testing, and credentialing may produce economically successful graduates who lack the philosophical resources needed for meaning-making. Students may learn to achieve external goals without developing internal compass for determining which goals are worth pursuing. Educational approaches that encourage critical thinking, moral reflection, and exploration of life's big questions may better prepare students for the meaning-making challenges they will face as adults. However, such approaches require educators who have themselves engaged with existential questions and developed meaning-making competencies. The relationship between existential vacuum and mental health reveals complex interactions that challenge traditional diagnostic categories and treatment approaches. People experiencing existential vacuum may develop secondary symptoms of depression, anxiety, or substance abuse as they struggle with their underlying meaninglessness. Treating these secondary symptoms without addressing the underlying meaning deficit often provides temporary relief, but fails to achieve lasting improvement. Conversely, people with clinical depression or anxiety may be misdiagnosed as having existential vacuum when their symptoms actually require medical or psychological rather than meaning-centered intervention. Effective assessment requires careful attention to the relationship between existential concerns and psychological symptoms, rather than assuming that all distress reflects meaning deficits. The generational aspects of existential vacuum reveal how different age cohorts may experience and express meaning deficits in distinctive ways. Younger generations who have grown up with social media and consumer culture may experience existential vacuum as chronic anxiety about missing out or failing to achieve idealized life trajectories. Middle-aged individuals may experience existential vacuum as midlife crisis when they realize that their achievements have not provided the fulfillment they expected. Older adults may experience existential vacuum as depression about lost opportunities or fear about legacy and mortality. Understanding these generational patterns can help in developing age-appropriate interventions while recognizing that existential concerns manifest differently across the lifespan. The prevention and treatment of existential vacuum require systematic approaches that address both individual meaning-making capacities and social conditions that support or undermine authentic purpose. Individual interventions focus on helping people develop skills for values clarification, meaning recognition, and authentic commitment despite cultural pressures toward conformity or materialism. Social interventions involve creating communities, institutions, and cultural practices that support rather than undermine meaning-making processes. This might include workplace reforms that provide opportunities for meaningful contribution, educational approaches that encourage philosophical reflection, and community programs that connect people with purposes larger than individual success. Effective approaches require coordination between individual healing and social change rather than focusing exclusively on either personal or political solutions. Part 10. Critique of Reductionism, Beyond Freud, Adler and Deterministic Psychology. Frankl's systematic critique of existing psychological theories emerged from his observation that dominant approaches reduced human beings to biological machines, psychological mechanisms or social products while ignoring their distinctly human capacities for meaning, choice and self-transcendence. This reductionism, he argued, was not merely intellectually inadequate, but practically harmful, leading to therapeutic approaches that inadvertently reinforced the very problems they claimed to solve. By treating humans as nothing but collections of drives, conditioned responses or social roles, psychology had become complicit in the dehumanization of modern life. Frankl's alternative approach insisted on human uniqueness without falling into unscientific romanticism, requiring sophisticated integration of scientific methods with humanistic insights. This theoretical revolution challenged psychology's foundational assumptions and demanded fundamental changes in research methods, therapeutic practices, and educational approaches. The critique of psychoanalytic reductionism focused on Freud's tendency to reduce all human motivation to sexual and aggressive drives operating according to the pleasure principle. While acknowledging the importance of unconscious processes and childhood development, Frankl argued that Freudian theory failed to account for distinctly human capacities for moral choice, spiritual aspiration, and self-sacrifice. The psychoanalytic emphasis on uncovering repressed conflicts often ignored present-moment choices and future-oriented goals that might be more relevant to psychological healing. Additionally, the deterministic assumptions of psychoanalysis could become self-fulfilling prophecies, encouraging people to view themselves as victims of unconscious forces rather than agents capable of conscious choice. Frankl's clinical experience suggested that many problems attributed to unconscious conflicts actually reflected meaning deficits that required existential rather than psychodynamic intervention. The specific mechanisms through which psychoanalytic reductionism could harm patients involved what Frankl called iatrogenic neurosis, psychological problems inadvertently created by therapeutic intervention itself. When therapists interpreted all behavior in terms of sexual symbolism or aggressive impulses, they might convince patients that their conscious values and aspirations were merely disguised expressions of primitive drives. This interpretive framework could undermine patients' confidence in their own moral intuitions and spiritual experiences, leading to increased cynicism and nihilism. Additionally, The psychoanalytic focus on pathology and unconscious conflicts might prevent patients from recognizing healthy aspects of their functioning and positive possibilities for growth. Frankl observed that some patients became worse rather than better through psychoanalytic treatment that systematically undermined their meaning-making capacities. The critique of individual psychology challenged Adler's reduction of human motivation to the will to power and the drive for superiority. While appreciating Adler's recognition of goal-directed behavior and social interest, Frankl argued that the power-seeking framework failed to explain genuine altruism, self-sacrifice, and spiritual aspiration. Many human behaviors that appeared to seek power actually reflected the search for meaning, with power being pursued as a means to meaningful contribution rather than as an end in itself. The Adlerian emphasis on overcoming feelings of inferiority could encourage compensatory striving that distracted from authentic self-discovery and genuine service to others. Frankl's observations suggested that people who found meaningful purposes often willingly accepted subordinate positions or personal limitations that served larger goals, contradicting the universal power-seeking assumption. The behavioral psychology critique addressed the reduction of human beings to stimulus-response mechanisms operating according to conditioning principles. While acknowledging the reality of learning and environmental influence, Frankl argued that behaviorism ignored the human capacity for choice between competing responses and the role of meaning in determining which environmental influences prove most powerful. Behavioral approaches often focused on symptom modification without addressing underlying value conflicts or meaning deficits that might be maintaining problematic behaviors. The mechanistic assumptions of behaviorism could also become dehumanizing when applied in institutional settings, treating people as objects to be modified rather than subjects capable of self-determination. Frankl observed that purely behavioral interventions sometimes achieved surface compliance while leaving deeper human needs unaddressed, leading to symptom substitution or treatment resistance. The humanistic psychology critique presented more complex challenges because thinkers like Maslow and Rogers shared Frankl's concern with human potential and self-actualization. However, Frankl argued that humanistic emphasis on self-fulfillment and personal growth could become narcissistic when divorced from self-transcendent values and service to others. The focus on self-actualization might encourage people to pursue personal development as an end in itself rather than as a means to meaningful contribution. Additionally, the optimistic assumptions of humanistic psychology about human nature might underestimate the reality of human limitation, suffering, and moral failure that require spiritual rather than psychological responses. Frankl's tragic optimism provided a more realistic alternative that acknowledged both human potential and human limitation without falling into either naive optimism or cynical pessimism. The cognitive psychology critique addressed the reduction of human experience to information processing mechanisms and thought patterns. While appreciating the importance of cognitive processes in psychological functioning, Frankl argued that cognitive approaches often ignored the emotional and spiritual dimensions of human experience that give life its meaning and purpose. Cognitive therapy's focus on changing dysfunctional thoughts might miss underlying value conflicts or meaning deficits that generate distressing thoughts as symptoms rather than causes of problems. The rational emphasis of cognitive approaches could also become intellectualized, helping people understand their problems without providing the emotional and spiritual resources needed for genuine transformation. Frankl observed that some patients could achieve cognitive insight about their thought patterns while remaining existentially empty, and emotionally disconnected. The biological psychiatry critique challenged the reduction of psychological problems to brain chemistry imbalances treatable through pharmaceutical intervention. While acknowledging the reality of neurochemical factors in mental illness, Frankl argued that exclusive focus on biological causes could prevent recognition of meaning-centered solutions to existential problems. Medications might alleviate symptoms of conditions like nogenic depression while leaving underlying meaning deficits unaddressed, creating dependent patients rather than empowered individuals. The biological emphasis could also encourage passive approaches to mental health that discourage personal responsibility and active meaning-making efforts. Frankl's dimensional ontology provided a framework for integrating biological, psychological, and noological factors without reducing higher-order phenomena to lower-order causes. The research methodology implications of anti-reductionism required developing approaches that could study human meaning-making without destroying it through overly mechanical analysis. Traditional experimental methods designed for studying physical and biological phenomena might be inadequate for investigating spiritual and existential dimensions of human experience. Meaning-centered research might require qualitative, phenomenological or participatory approaches that honored the subjective and value-laden nature of human meaning-making. However, maintaining scientific rigor while studying spiritual phenomena required sophisticated methodology that could avoid both reductionism and uncritical subjectivism. Frankl advocated for what he called dimensional research that could study human beings at multiple levels without reducing higher levels to lower ones. The therapeutic integration challenge involved developing approaches that could address biological, psychological and noological dimensions simultaneously without losing focus on any particular level. Effective treatment might require coordination between medical professionals addressing biological factors, psychotherapists addressing psychological factors, and spiritual counselors addressing noological factors. However, this multidisciplinary approach required professionals who understood the interactions between dimensions rather than working in isolation from each other. Frankl himself demonstrated such integration through his medical training, psychological expertise, and philosophical sophistication that enabled comprehensive assessment and treatment. Training future professionals in anti-reductionist approaches requires educational programs that develop competence across multiple dimensions of human experience. The cultural implications of anti-reductionism extend beyond psychology to challenge materialistic worldviews that reduce human beings to economic units, political variables, or biological specimens. Frankl's emphasis on human dignity and uniqueness supports resistance to totalitarian ideologies that justify treating people as expendable means to political ends. The recognition of spiritual dimensions also supports dialogue between religious and secular worldviews that might otherwise remain incompatible. However, anti-reductionism must avoid becoming anti-scientific, maintaining commitment to empirical investigation while expanding the scope of legitimate scientific inquiry. The challenge involves developing cultural frameworks that honor both scientific knowledge and spiritual wisdom without sacrificing either to the other. Part 11. Self-Transcendence, the paradox of finding self through losing self. Self-transcendence represents perhaps the most counterintuitive and profound aspect of Frankl's psychological anthropology, suggesting that human beings find their authentic selves not through introspection and self-focus, but through reaching beyond themselves towards something or someone of greater significance. This paradox challenges dominant cultural assumptions about self-actualization, personal development and individual fulfillment that encourage people to look inward for answers to life's fundamental questions. Frankl argued that the self is constituted through its relationships and commitments rather than existing as an independent entity that can be discovered through self-analysis. The capacity for self-transcendence distinguishes humans from other animals and enables the distinctly human experiences of love, service, creativity, and spiritual aspiration. Understanding and cultivating self-transcendence becomes crucial for both psychological healing and human flourishing in ways that purely self-focused approaches cannot achieve. The psychological mechanisms underlying self-transcendence involve complex cognitive and emotional processes that enable people to experience their own existence as meaningful through connection to something beyond immediate self-interest. Neurologically, self-transcendent experiences activate brain networks associated with reduced self-referential thinking and increased attention to external reality and other people. These neural changes correspond to subjective experiences of expanded awareness, emotional connection and sense of purpose that people report during moments of genuine self-transcendence. The psychological benefits include reduced anxiety and depression, increased resilience and life satisfaction, and enhanced capacity for moral behavior and interpersonal connection. However, achieving genuine self-transcendence requires overcoming deeply ingrained habits of self-focus and developing capacities for sustained attention to transpersonal values and relationships. The phenomenology of self-transcendent experiences reveals distinctive qualitative features that distinguish them from other psychological states. During self-transcendent moments, people typically report decreased awareness of their own ego boundaries and increased sense of unity with something larger than themselves. Time consciousness often changes, with people experiencing either timelessness or deep absorption in present-moment experience. Self-consciousness and self-criticism diminish, replaced by natural spontaneity and authentic expression. These experiences feel intrinsically meaningful, rather than requiring external validation or justification, providing direct access to purpose and significance that bypasses analytical thought processes. The objects of self-transcendence vary widely across individuals and cultures, but share common characteristics that enable the transcendent experience. Some people transcend themselves through love relationships that involve genuine care for another person's welfare beyond their own immediate interests. Others achieve transcendence through creative work that expresses values or beauty that matter more than personal recognition or material reward. Still others find transcendence through service to causes, communities, or principles that they believe deserve their dedication regardless of personal cost. Religious and spiritual traditions provide systematic frameworks for self-transcendence through relationship with the divine, cosmic consciousness, or ultimate reality. The developmental trajectory of self-transcendence reveals how this capacity emerges and matures across the human lifespan. Children show natural capacity for self-transcendence through imaginative play, wonder at natural beauty, and spontaneous compassion for others in distress. Adolescence often involves idealistic commitments to causes and relationships that represent early forms of self-transcendence, though these may be unstable due to incomplete identity formation. Young adulthood typically focuses on self-establishment through career and relationship building, sometimes temporarily reducing transcendent capacity in favor of self-development. Mature adulthood often brings renewed capacity for self-transcendence as people develop confidence in their identity and begin looking beyond personal achievement toward contribution and legacy. The obstacles to self-transcendence in modern culture include systematic encouragement of narcissistic self-focus and individualistic achievement that can prevent the development of transcendent capacities. Consumer culture constantly redirects attention toward personal desires, preferences, and image management rather than toward values and relationships that might enable transcendence. Social media amplifies these tendencies by providing constant opportunities for self-promotion and external validation that can become addictive substitutes for genuine transcendent engagement. Therapeutic approaches that emphasize self-esteem, self-care, and personal happiness as primary goals may inadvertently reinforce self-focus while neglecting transcendent dimensions of human flourishing. Educational systems that reward individual achievement over collaborative service may also impede the development of transcendent capacities during crucial formative periods. The relationship between self-transcendence and psychological health reveals complex patterns that challenge simple assumptions about mental wellness. People who report high levels of self-transcendent experience typically show better outcomes on measures of life satisfaction, resilience, and meaning in life. However, some forms of apparent self-transcendence may actually represent escape from psychological problems rather than genuine transcendence that integrates rather than avoids personal difficulties. Spiritual bypassing involves using transcendent practices to avoid dealing with psychological wounds, interpersonal conflicts, or practical responsibilities that require direct attention. Authentic self-transcendence typically involves integration of personal development with transcendent commitment rather than abandonment of self-care in favor of other focus. The moral dimensions of self-transcendence involve questions about which objects of transcendence are worthy and which forms of self-transcendence promote rather than hinder human flourishing. History provides examples of destructive forms of self-transcendence through fanatical devotion to harmful ideologies, abusive relationships, or addictive substances that people experience as meaningful despite their destructive consequences. Authentic self-transcendence appears to require objects that genuinely merit devotion, rather than simply providing escape from self-consciousness or personal responsibility. This suggests the need for moral criteria that can distinguish between constructive and destructive forms of transcendence without imposing particular religious or philosophical frameworks on diverse individuals. The development of such criteria requires ongoing dialogue between psychological research and ethical reflection that honors both empirical evidence and moral wisdom. The therapeutic applications of self-transcendence involve helping clients shift from self-focused to transcendent orientations without minimizing legitimate self-care needs or psychological problems requiring direct attention. This might involve exploring clients' values and commitments to identify authentic sources of meaning that extend beyond immediate self-interest. Therapists might encourage volunteer work, creative expression, or spiritual practices that provide opportunities for transcendent experience while supporting rather than undermining psychological healing. However, these interventions require careful timing and assessment to avoid encouraging premature transcendence that bypasses necessary personal development work. The therapeutic relationship itself can model healthy transcendence when therapists demonstrate genuine care for clients' welfare beyond their own professional interests or theoretical commitments. The research challenges in studying self-transcendence include developing measures that can capture subjective transcendent experiences without reducing them to psychological mechanisms or neurological processes. Traditional psychological research methods may be inadequate for investigating phenomena that essentially involve going beyond the self that serves as the subject of most psychological study. Transcendent experiences may require first-person phenomenological approaches, contemplative research methods, or participatory investigations that involve researchers in the phenomena they study. However, maintaining scientific rigor while studying transcendent phenomena requires sophisticated methodology that can avoid both reductionism and uncritical subjectivism. The field needs research approaches that can honor the reality of transcendent experiences while contributing to cumulative scientific knowledge about human nature and potential. Contemporary relevance of self-transcendence becomes particularly apparent in addressing modern problems like depression, anxiety, addiction, and social isolation that may partly reflect deficits in transcendent capacity rather than simply psychological or biological dysfunction. Many therapeutic approaches focus on helping people feel better about themselves rather than helping them find purposes worth feeling good about. Self-transcendence offers an alternative approach that addresses existential dimensions of psychological distress while complementing rather than replacing traditional therapeutic methods. Additionally, global challenges like climate change, inequality, and social fragmentation may require transcendent motivations that enable people to sacrifice immediate self-interest for collective welfare and future generations. Cultivating self-transcendence may therefore be not only individually beneficial, but socially necessary for addressing contemporary challenges that require cooperation and long-term thinking. Part 12. The Moral Foundation of Meaning, Ethics, Values and Human Responsibility. The relationship between meaning and morality in Frankl's system involves more than simple correlation, representing instead a fundamental interdependence where authentic meaning emerges through moral engagement, while moral behavior requires meaningful commitment that transcends immediate self-interest. This position challenges both relativistic approaches that treat values as purely subjective preferences and absolutistic approaches that impose universal moral codes without reference to individual circumstances and calling. Frankl argued for what might be called moral realism, tempered by existential particularity, suggesting that while moral principles have objective validity, their application requires contextual wisdom and personal responsibility that cannot be reduced to rule-following. The moral dimensions of meaning-making therefore involve both discovery of universal human values and creative application of those values to unique individual circumstances. This sophisticated ethical framework enables moral guidance without moral coercion while maintaining standards without sacrificing authenticity. The ontological foundation of moral meaning rests on Frankl's observation that human consciousness inherently recognizes distinctions between what is and what ought to be, generating moral tension that motivates both individual development and social progress. This moral sense appears to be universal across cultures, though its specific content varies significantly between different communities and traditions. The capacity for moral judgment seems to emerge naturally during human development, suggesting biological foundations for ethical behavior that transcend cultural programming. However, the development of mature moral reasoning requires education, reflection, and community support that help people move beyond conventional rule-following toward principled ethical thinking. The interplay between innate moral capacity and cultural moral learning creates both universal ethical foundations and particular moral expressions that must be navigated thoughtfully. The psychology of moral meaning involves complex cognitive and emotional processes that integrate rational reflection with empathic connection and intuitive wisdom. Moral emotions like compassion, indignation, and guilt provide motivational energy for ethical behavior, while rational analysis helps determine appropriate responses to moral situations. The capacity for moral imagination enables people to envision consequences of their actions and alternative responses that might better serve ethical principles. Moral courage allows people to act on their ethical convictions despite social pressure or personal cost. These various moral capacities must work together harmoniously for authentic ethical living, as deficits in any area can compromise moral behavior despite good intentions. The developmental trajectory of moral meaning reveals how ethical capacity emerges and matures through interaction between innate moral intuitions and social moral learning. Children show early capacity for fairness, empathy, and helping behavior that appears to develop naturally through social interaction rather than explicit moral instruction. Adolescence typically involves moral idealism and questioning of conventional ethical standards as young people develop capacity for abstract moral reasoning. Young adulthood often brings moral relativism as people encounter diverse value systems and struggle to maintain ethical commitments in complex social environments. Mature moral development involves integration of universal ethical principles with contextual wisdom that enables flexible yet principled responses to moral dilemmas. The cultural variations in moral meaning reflect different wisdom traditions about human nature, social responsibility, and ultimate purpose, while sharing common concerns for human welfare and social cooperation. Western moral traditions often emphasize individual rights, personal autonomy, and rational moral principles that can be universally applied. Eastern traditions may emphasize relational harmony, social obligation, and spiritual development that transcends individual moral achievement. Indigenous traditions often emphasize connection to natural cycles, ancestral wisdom, and community survival that places individual moral choices within larger ecological and temporal contexts. Understanding these cultural differences enables cross-cultural moral dialogue while avoiding both moral imperialism and moral relativism. The existential dimensions of moral meaning involve recognition that ethical choices define who people become rather than simply determining what they do. Every moral decision contributes to character formation and identity development in ways that accumulate over time to create stable personality patterns and life trajectories. This existential weight of moral choice explains why people often experience anxiety when facing significant ethical dilemmas, as they intuitively recognize that their decisions will shape their future selves. The irreversible nature of moral choices also explains why guilt and regret can be so psychologically powerful, representing recognition that past moral failures have created character deficits that cannot be simply undone. However, the ongoing nature of moral choice also provides hope that people can reshape their character through sustained commitment to ethical behavior despite past failures. The relationship between moral meaning and psychological health reveals complex patterns that challenge simple assumptions about the benefits of ethical behavior. People who report strong moral commitments and ethical behavior typically show better outcomes on measures of life satisfaction, purpose, and psychological resilience. However, rigid moral perfectionism can create psychological problems through excessive guilt, self-criticism, and inflexibility in responding to complex situations. Moral injury, which occurs when people are forced to act against their ethical convictions or witness moral atrocities they cannot prevent, can create lasting psychological damage. The challenge involves maintaining moral sensitivity without moral rigidity, ethical commitment without ethical grandiosity, and moral responsibility without moral self-punishment. The social dimensions of moral meaning involve the complex interactions between individual ethical development and collective moral progress that shape both personal character and social institutions. Individual moral choices contribute to social moral climate through modeling effects, social influence and institutional participation that can either support or undermine ethical behavior in others. Social moral norms and institutions shape individual moral development by providing frameworks, expectations, and supports that influence ethical reasoning and behavior. The relationship between individual and social morality can be either mutually reinforcing or conflicted, requiring wisdom about when to conform to social moral expectations and when to resist them in favor of higher principles. Understanding these dynamics enables more effective moral education and social reform efforts that address both personal and structural dimensions of ethical problems. The therapeutic applications of moral meaning involve helping clients clarify their authentic values and develop capacity for ethical behavior that enhances rather than compromises psychological well-being. This requires careful attention to distinguishing between authentic moral convictions and neurotic guilt, perfectionism or people-pleasing that masquerades as ethical behavior. Therapists must also navigate the tension between supporting clients' autonomous moral development and providing guidance about moral choices that affect their welfare and that of others. Values clarification exercises can help clients identify their deepest commitments, while moral reasoning training can enhance their capacity for ethical decision-making in complex situations. However, these interventions must be carefully implemented to avoid imposing particular moral frameworks while still supporting healthy moral development. The philosophical challenges in moral meaning involve questions about the source and justification of ethical principles that guide meaningful living. Some philosophers argue that moral principles are objective features of reality that can be discovered through reason or spiritual insight. Others contend that moral principles are human constructions that serve practical purposes but lack objective foundation. Still others suggest that moral principles emerge through evolutionary processes that promote social cooperation and species survival. Frankl's position appears to combine elements of all these approaches, suggesting that moral principles have objective validity within the context of human nature and social life, while requiring creative application to particular circumstances. Contemporary relevance of moral meaning becomes particularly apparent in addressing modern challenges like bioethics, environmental responsibility, global justice and technological ethics that require moral reasoning about unprecedented situations. Traditional moral frameworks may provide insufficient guidance for navigating ethical dilemmas involving genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, climate change, and global economic inequality. Developing adequate responses to these challenges requires moral imagination, cross-cultural dialogue, and integration of empirical knowledge with ethical wisdom that exemplifies Frankl's approach to moral meaning-making. Additionally, the rapid pace of social change requires moral flexibility and learning capacity that can adapt ethical principles to new circumstances without abandoning core human values. The cultivation of moral meaning therefore becomes not only individually important but collectively necessary for navigating the ethical challenges of contemporary life. Part 13. Contemporary research and empirical validation: science meets existentialism. The empirical investigation of Frankl's theoretical propositions presents unique methodological challenges because meaning-centered phenomena resist easy quantification while nevertheless requiring rigorous scientific study to establish their validity and clinical utility. Traditional psychological research methods designed for studying observable behaviors and measurable outcomes must be adapted to investigate subjective experiences of meaning, purpose, and spiritual transcendence that form the core of logotherapy theory. This methodological tension has generated innovative research approaches that attempt to bridge the gap between humanistic insights and scientific rigor, without sacrificing either existential depth or empirical validity. The resulting body of research provides substantial support for many of Frankl's central claims, while also revealing limitations and areas requiring theoretical refinement. Understanding this research landscape becomes crucial for evaluating the contemporary relevance and clinical applicability of meaning-centered approaches to psychological healing and human development. The development of meaning measurement instruments represents one of the most significant advances in operationalizing Frankl's theoretical concepts for empirical investigation. The Purpose in Life test, developed by Krumbaugh and Maholic in collaboration with Frankl, was among the first attempts to quantify existential fulfillment and meaning deficit. Subsequent instruments like the Life Regard Index, Meaning in Life Questionnaire, and Sources of Meaning and Meaning in Life Questionnaire have provided increasingly sophisticated approaches to measuring different aspects of meaning experience. These instruments have enabled large-scale studies investigating the relationships between meaning variables and psychological health outcomes across diverse populations and cultural contexts. However, the validity of such instruments depends on whether quantitative measures can capture the essential features of subjective meaning experiences without reducing them to psychological mechanisms. Outcome research on logotherapy and meaning-centered interventions has demonstrated significant effectiveness for various psychological conditions, particularly those involving existential concerns and meaning deficits. Studies have shown that logotherapy approaches can be effective for depression, anxiety, substance abuse, chronic pain, and terminal illness when existential factors contribute to psychological distress. Meta-analytic reviews of meaning-centered interventions indicate effect sizes comparable to other established therapeutic approaches, supporting the clinical utility of addressing meaning and purpose in psychological treatment. However, the research also reveals that meaning-centered approaches may be more effective for certain populations and conditions than others, requiring careful assessment to determine when such interventions are most appropriate. The challenge involves identifying which clients and circumstances benefit most from meaning-focused versus symptom-focused therapeutic approaches. Neuroscience research has provided fascinating insights into the biological substrates of meaning experiences and self-transcendent states that align remarkably well with Frankl's theoretical predictions. Brain imaging studies reveal that meaningful activities activate neural networks associated with reward processing, social cognition, and executive control in patterns distinct from simple pleasure or achievement experiences. Research on meditation and contemplative practices shows that self-transcendent experiences involve reduced activity in brain regions associated with self-referential thinking and increased connectivity between areas involved in attention and empathy. Studies of people who report high levels of meaning in life show different patterns of brain structure and function, including enhanced connectivity between regions involved in emotional regulation and cognitive control. These neurobiological findings support Frankl's contention that meaning-seeking represents a distinct human capacity that cannot be reduced to other motivational systems. Cross-cultural research has both validated and challenged aspects of Frankl's theoretical framework by examining how meaning-making processes operate across different cultural contexts and value systems. Studies consistently find that the relationship between meaning and psychological well-being exists across diverse cultures, supporting the universality of meaning as a fundamental human need. However, research also reveals significant cultural variations in what people consider meaningful and how they go about creating purpose in their lives. Individualistic cultures tend to emphasize personal achievement and self-actualization as sources of meaning, while collectivistic cultures focus more on family, community, and social harmony. These cultural differences raise important questions about the applicability of meaning-centered interventions developed in Western contexts to clients from different cultural backgrounds. Longitudinal research has provided valuable insights into how meaning develops and changes across the lifespan, and how meaning-making capacity affects long-term psychological and physical health outcomes. Studies following people over decades reveal that those who report higher levels of purpose and meaning in life show better outcomes on measures of cognitive functioning, physical health, and longevity. Research on meaning-making following traumatic experiences supports Frankl's observations about the potential for growth through suffering, showing that many people develop enhanced sense of purpose and life appreciation following adversity. However, longitudinal studies also reveal that not everyone benefits from traumatic experiences, and that the capacity for meaning-making appears to depend on various personal and environmental factors. Understanding these individual differences becomes crucial for developing more targeted and effective meaning-centered interventions. Research on specific logotherapy techniques has provided mixed but generally supportive evidence for their effectiveness in clinical applications. Studies of paradoxical intention show effectiveness for certain anxiety disorders, sleep problems, and obsessive-compulsive symptoms, though the technique appears to work best with specific populations and conditions. Research on dereflection techniques demonstrates benefits for performance anxiety, sexual dysfunction, and excessive self-focus, supporting Frankl's emphasis on self-transcendence. However, some studies suggest that these techniques may be less effective than alternative approaches for certain conditions, highlighting the importance of careful assessment and treatment matching. The research indicates that logotherapy techniques are valuable additions to the therapeutic toolkit rather than universal solutions for all psychological problems. The integration of meaning-centered approaches with evidence-based therapies has generated innovative treatment models that combine existential insights with empirically supported techniques. Acceptance and commitment therapy incorporates values clarification and psychological flexibility concepts that align closely with logotherapy principles while maintaining rigorous empirical foundations. Meaning-centered psychotherapy for cancer patients integrates logotherapy concepts with structured intervention protocols that have demonstrated effectiveness in randomized controlled trials. Post-traumatic stress treatments increasingly incorporate meaning-making and benefit-finding components that help survivors develop coherent narratives about their experiences. These integrative approaches suggest that meaning-centered concepts can enhance rather than replace existing therapeutic methods when thoughtfully combined. Research on meaning and physical health has revealed remarkable connections between existential factors and biological functioning that support Frankl's holistic understanding of human nature. Studies show that people with higher sense of purpose have better immune function, lower inflammation markers, and reduced risk of cardiovascular disease and dementia. Research on telomeres, the DNA structures associated with cellular aging, indicates that meaning and purpose may literally slow biological aging processes. Studies of gene expression show that different types of well-being, including meaning-based versus pleasure-based happiness, are associated with different patterns of genetic activity. These findings suggest that meaning may affect health through complex biological pathways that extend far beyond simple stress reduction. Contemporary challenges in meaning research include developing more sophisticated research methods that can capture the complexity and depth of existential phenomena while maintaining scientific rigor. Traditional experimental designs may be inadequate for studying meaning-making processes that unfold over long time periods and involve highly personal and contextual factors. Mixed methods approaches that combine quantitative and qualitative methodologies may be necessary to capture both general patterns and individual variations in meaning experience. Additionally, the field needs research that can distinguish between authentic meaning and superficial meaning substitutes that may provide temporary psychological benefits without promoting genuine flourishing. Future research must also address questions about the optimal timing, duration and dosage of meaning-centered interventions for different populations and conditions. The implications of contemporary meaning research extend beyond clinical applications to inform educational, workplace and social policy initiatives that could promote meaning-making capacity at population levels. Research-informed approaches to education might emphasize character development, moral reasoning, and exploration of life's big questions alongside academic skill development. Workplace interventions based on meaning research could focus on helping employees connect their daily tasks to larger purposes and values that enhance both performance and job satisfaction. Social policies informed by meaning research might prioritize community building, volunteer opportunities, and civic engagement that provide meaningful roles for people across the lifespan. The challenge involves translating research findings into practical interventions that can be implemented effectively in real-world settings while maintaining fidelity to evidence-based principles. Part 14, Cross-Cultural Perspectives and Universal Human Needs. The universality of meaning seeking across human cultures provides compelling evidence for Frankl's contention that the will to meaning represents a fundamental aspect of human nature rather than a culturally specific phenomenon limited to particular societies or historical periods. Anthropological research consistently reveals that every known human culture develops meaning-making systems, whether religious, philosophical or secular, that address fundamental questions about life purpose, moral obligation, and human destiny. However, the specific content and expression of meaning-making vary dramatically across cultures, creating both opportunities for cross-cultural dialogue and challenges for developing culturally sensitive therapeutic approaches. Understanding these cultural variations, while recognizing underlying universals, becomes crucial for applying meaning-centered principles across diverse populations without imposing particular cultural frameworks on people from different backgrounds. This requires sophisticated appreciation for both human commonalities and cultural differences that avoids both cultural imperialism and relativistic paralysis. Eastern philosophical traditions provide rich resources for understanding meaning-making that both complement and challenge aspects of Frankl's Western existential approach. Buddhist concepts of suffering, impermanence, and non-self offer different perspectives on how people can find meaning in difficult circumstances while maintaining psychological equanimity. The Buddhist emphasis on compassion and interconnectedness aligns with Frankl's self-transcendence concepts while providing specific practices for cultivating these capacities. However, the Buddhist goal of liberation from suffering through detachment contrasts with Frankl's emphasis on engagement with unavoidable suffering as a source of meaning. Hindu traditions of Dharma provide frameworks for understanding individual life purpose within cosmic order that resonate with logotherapy's emphasis on unique calling while differing in their metaphysical assumptions. Confucian traditions emphasize social harmony, filial piety, and moral cultivation that prioritize collective over individual meaning in ways that challenge Western existential emphasis on personal choice and authenticity. The Confucian concept of Ren, often translated as humaneness or benevolence, provides a framework for meaning through proper relationships and social responsibility that transcends individual self-actualization. Taoist traditions offer perspectives on meaning through harmony with natural order and effortless action that contrast with Western emphasis on active choice and moral striving. These Eastern approaches suggest that meaning-making may involve receptivity and acceptance as much as active engagement and responsibility. Integrating Eastern insights with logotherapy principles requires careful attention to underlying assumptions about self, society, and ultimate reality that may differ significantly between traditions. Indigenous wisdom traditions from around the world provide holistic approaches to meaning that integrate individual purpose with community welfare, natural cycles, and ancestral wisdom in ways that challenge individualistic assumptions of Western psychology. Many indigenous cultures understand meaning through connection to land, traditional practices, and intergenerational relationships that extend beyond individual lifetime and personal achievement. The emphasis on reciprocity, balance, and spiritual connection in indigenous traditions offers resources for understanding meaning that may be particularly relevant for addressing contemporary environmental and social challenges. However, applying indigenous insights to modern therapeutic contexts requires respectful collaboration with indigenous communities and careful attention to avoiding cultural appropriation or superficial borrowing. The challenge involves learning from indigenous wisdom while honoring its cultural context and protecting indigenous intellectual property rights. African philosophical traditions like Ubuntu emphasize communal identity and interdependence that understand individual meaning as inseparable from community well-being and social harmony. The Ubuntu principle that "I am because we are" provides a framework for meaning that transcends individual self-actualization through recognition of fundamental human interconnectedness. African traditions often emphasize storytelling, ritual, and community participation as vehicles for meaning-making that engage whole persons rather than just cognitive understanding. These communal approaches to meaning offer important resources for addressing individualistic excesses in Western meaning-making while providing culturally relevant frameworks for African populations. However, applying African philosophical insights requires understanding their specific cultural contexts and avoiding romantic idealization of traditional practices. Islamic perspectives on meaning emphasize submission to divine will, moral responsibility, and community service that provide frameworks for purpose that transcend individual desires while honoring human dignity and choice. The concept of Khalifa, or human stewardship of creation, offers a framework for meaning through responsible care for the natural world and social justice. Islamic emphasis on both this worldly engagement and other worldly orientation provides resources for understanding how people can find meaning in temporal activities while maintaining perspective on ultimate concerns. The integration of individual responsibility with divine guidance in Islamic thought resonates with logotherapy's emphasis on freedom and responsibility, while providing different metaphysical foundations. Understanding Islamic approaches to meaning requires appreciation for the role of faith, community, and divine relationship in providing life purpose and moral guidance. Jewish traditions offer rich resources for understanding meaning through concepts like tikkun olam, or repair of the world, that emphasize human partnership with divine purposes in creating justice and wholeness. The Jewish emphasis on learning, questioning, and moral argument provides frameworks for meaning, making that honor both tradition and innovation. Jewish historical experience of persecution and survival offers insights into finding meaning through suffering that align closely with Frankl's observations from the concentration camps. The Jewish concept of mitzvah, or commanded good deed, suggests that meaning emerges through faithful response to moral obligation rather than through personal choice alone. These Jewish insights informed Frankl's own thinking while providing broader resources for understanding meaning through religious and ethical commitment. Contemporary secular approaches to meaning in different cultures reveal diverse ways that non-religious populations create purpose and significance without traditional religious frameworks. Scandinavian cultures emphasize social democratic values, environmental responsibility, and work-life balance that provide meaning through collective welfare and sustainable living. East Asian secular cultures often emphasize educational achievement, family honor, and economic development as sources of meaning that transcend individual gratification. Latin American cultures may emphasize family relationships, cultural celebration, and social solidarity as primary sources of life purpose and meaning. Understanding these secular meaning-making systems helps therapists work effectively with non-religious clients, while recognizing that secularism itself takes culturally specific forms. The therapeutic implications of cross-cultural meaning perspectives require developing culturally responsive approaches that honor clients' cultural backgrounds while addressing universal human needs for purpose and significance. This involves understanding how different cultures conceptualize the relationship between individual and community, present and future, material and spiritual dimensions of existence. Therapists must develop cultural competence that enables them to recognize when meaning deficits reflect cultural displacement or value conflicts rather than simply individual psychological problems. Effective cross-cultural therapy may require integrating traditional healing practices, religious or spiritual frameworks, and community involvement alongside individual therapeutic work. The challenge involves maintaining therapeutic effectiveness while respecting cultural diversity and avoiding the imposition of Western therapeutic assumptions on clients from different backgrounds. Research on cultural variations in meaning reveals both universal patterns and significant differences that inform cross-cultural applications of meaning-centered approaches. Studies consistently find that relationships, achievement, religion, and self-transcendence serve as sources of meaning across cultures, though their relative importance varies significantly. Cross-cultural research also reveals differences in how people understand concepts like individual choice, moral responsibility, and life purpose that affect therapeutic approaches. Some cultures emphasize collective decision-making and social conformity in ways that challenge Western emphasis on individual choice and authenticity. Understanding these cultural variations helps therapists adapt meaning-centered interventions to fit clients' cultural backgrounds while maintaining therapeutic effectiveness. The future of cross-cultural meaning work requires developing collaborative approaches that honor diverse wisdom traditions while addressing shared human challenges that transcend cultural boundaries. Global problems like climate change, economic inequality, and social fragmentation may require cross-cultural dialogue about meaning and purpose that can mobilize cooperative responses. This involves creating frameworks for conversation between different cultural approaches to meaning that can identify common ground without erasing important differences. Educational and therapeutic institutions need to develop multicultural competence that can work effectively with diverse populations while maintaining commitment to human dignity and psychological healing. The ultimate challenge involves creating unity without uniformity, recognizing both human commonalities and cultural distinctiveness in approaches to meaning and purpose. Part 15. Integration, Critique and Future Directions, the Living Legacy of Viktor Frankl. The comprehensive evaluation of Frankl's psychological and philosophical system reveals a complex intellectual achievement that has fundamentally influenced contemporary understanding of human nature, psychological healing, and the conditions for human flourishing across multiple disciplines and cultural contexts. His integration of existential philosophy, clinical observation, and therapeutic practice created a unique approach that addresses dimensions of human experience, often neglected by both medical and psychological approaches, while maintaining scientific rigor and practical applicability. However, this systematic evaluation must acknowledge both the profound insights and significant limitations of Frankl's work, while considering how his contributions can be extended, refined, and adapted to meet contemporary challenges. The enduring relevance of his approach lies not in its completeness, but in its recognition of essential aspects of human experience that require ongoing investigation and practical application. Understanding both the achievements and limitations of Frankl's legacy provides foundation for future developments in meaning-centered approaches to psychology, therapy, and human development. The theoretical achievements of Frankl's system include the identification of meaning as a fundamental human motivation that cannot be reduced to pleasure-seeking or power-striving, the recognition of human freedom and responsibility within constraints, and the development of therapeutic approaches that address existential as well as psychological dimensions of human distress. His dimensional ontology provides a sophisticated framework for understanding human nature that avoids both reductionist materialism and naive spiritualism, while enabling integration of biological, psychological, and spiritual perspectives. The concept of tragic optimism offers a mature approach to human limitation and suffering that maintains hope and meaning-making capacity without falling into denial or superficial positive thinking. His emphasis on self-transcendence provides crucial insights into human fulfillment that challenge narcissistic and individualistic approaches to personal development. These theoretical contributions have influenced not only psychology and psychotherapy, but also fields like education, organizational development, medical care, and social policy. The clinical achievements include the development of specific therapeutic techniques like paradoxical intention and dereflection that have demonstrated effectiveness for various psychological conditions, particularly those involving anxiety, obsessive thinking, and performance problems. The logotherapy approach to working with terminally ill patients has provided valuable frameworks for helping people find meaning in the face of death and loss. Meaning-centered interventions have shown effectiveness for depression, substance abuse and trauma recovery when existential factors contribute to psychological distress. The emphasis on values, clarification and meaning exploration has enriched therapeutic approaches across different theoretical orientations. However, research also reveals limitations in the applicability of meaning-centered approaches, particularly for severe mental illness, acute trauma, and conditions requiring intensive medical or behavioral intervention. Plotted final analysis strategy with depth and precision. I need to continue with the final part of this comprehensive analysis, focusing on critiques, limitations, and future directions. I should maintain the same depth and format while avoiding redundancy with previous content. The philosophical achievements involve the development of a humanistic anthropology that recognizes both human uniqueness and human limitation, while avoiding both grandiose humanism and cynical reductionism. Frankl's integration of freedom and determinism provides a sophisticated position that acknowledges causal influences on human behavior while maintaining space for moral responsibility and authentic choice. His approach to the relationship between meaning and morality offers resources for ethical living that honor both universal principles and individual circumstances. The recognition of spiritual dimensions of human experience provides frameworks for dialogue between religious and secular worldviews, without requiring either to abandon their distinctive insights. These philosophical contributions have influenced not only psychology, but also ethics, theology, and social philosophy in ways that continue to generate productive dialogue and development. The significant limitations of Frankl's system include insufficient attention to social and political dimensions of meaning-making that may be as important as individual factors in determining whether people can find purpose and significance in their lives. His emphasis on individual choice and responsibility, while valuable, may underestimate the impact of systemic oppression, economic inequality, and social marginalization on people's capacity for meaning-making. The approach may be most applicable to relatively privileged populations who have basic security and freedom to pursue meaning, while being less relevant for people struggling with poverty, discrimination, or political oppression. Additionally, some of Frankl's claims about the universality of meaning-seeking may reflect cultural biases from his particular background and historical context. The therapeutic applications may work better for certain personality types and cultural backgrounds than others, requiring more systematic research on individual differences and cultural variations. The empirical limitations include insufficient research on the long-term effectiveness of meaning-centered interventions and inadequate understanding of which populations and conditions benefit most from these approaches. Many studies of logotherapy have been small-scale or methodologically limited, requiring larger and more rigorous investigations to establish the evidence base. The measurement of meaning and purpose remains challenging, with existing instruments potentially capturing only surface manifestations of deeper existential phenomena. Additionally, the research base has been dominated by Western educated populations, limiting knowledge about how meaning-centered approaches apply across diverse cultural contexts. Future research needs to address these limitations through more sophisticated methodology and more diverse participant populations. The integration challenges involve developing approaches that can address biological, psychological, and existential dimensions of human experience simultaneously without losing focus on any particular level. This requires training mental health professionals in multidimensional assessment and treatment that goes beyond traditional psychological or medical approaches. Integration also involves collaboration between different disciplines and professions that may have conflicting assumptions about human nature and appropriate intervention strategies. The challenge of maintaining meaning-centered focus while addressing practical mental health needs requires sophisticated clinical judgment and flexible treatment approaches. Educational institutions need to develop curricula that can prepare professionals for this multidimensional work while maintaining competence in specific areas of expertise. Contemporary applications of Frankl's insights have expanded far beyond individual psychotherapy to include organizational development, educational reform, medical care, and social policy initiatives. Businesses are increasingly recognizing the importance of employee meaning and purpose for both productivity and retention, leading to workplace interventions based on meaning-centered principles. Educational institutions are exploring how to incorporate character development and meaning exploration alongside academic achievement to prepare students for fulfilling lives. Medical institutions are developing meaning-centered approaches to patient care that address existential as well as physical aspects of illness and recovery. Social policy initiatives are beginning to consider how community design, civic engagement opportunities, and cultural programming can support meaning-making at population levels. Future directions for meaning-centered psychology include developing more sophisticated understanding of how meaning-making capacity develops across the lifespan and how it can be enhanced through targeted interventions. Research needs to investigate the neurobiological substrates of meaning experience more thoroughly to understand how biological, psychological, and existential factors interact. Cross-cultural research should explore how different cultures conceptualize and cultivate meaning to develop more culturally responsive therapeutic approaches. Technology applications might include digital interventions that can provide meaning-centered support to broader populations while maintaining the depth and personalization needed for effective intervention. Integration with other therapeutic approaches requires systematic investigation of how meaning-centered techniques can enhance rather than compete with existing evidence-based treatments. The social implications of meaning-centered approaches extend to addressing contemporary challenges like social isolation, environmental degradation, and global inequality that may require collective meaning-making and cooperative action. Understanding how communities and societies can support individual meaning-making while pursuing shared goals becomes crucial for addressing problems that transcend individual therapeutic intervention. This involves developing frameworks for social meaning that can motivate collective action while respecting individual differences in values and life purpose. Educational and political institutions need to consider how they can support rather than undermine meaning-making processes at both individual and collective levels. The ultimate challenge involves creating societies that enable rather than constrain human flourishing through meaningful engagement with life's fundamental challenges and opportunities. The enduring significance of Viktor Frankl's contribution lies not in providing final answers to questions about human nature and purpose, but in recognizing essential dimensions of human experience that require ongoing attention and development. His recognition that humans are meaning-seeking beings who find fulfillment through self-transcendence provides foundational insights for psychology, education, and social policy that remain relevant despite changes in cultural context and scientific understanding. The emphasis on human freedom and responsibility within constraints offers resources for maintaining dignity and hope in difficult circumstances, while acknowledging realistic limitations on human choice and control. The integration of scientific rigor with existential depth provides a model for addressing human concerns that require both empirical investigation and philosophical reflection. Most importantly, Frankl's work demonstrates that human beings possess capacities for meaning, choice, and transcendence that enable resilience, growth, and contribution even in the most challenging circumstances. The living legacy of Frankl's work continues through the countless individuals who have found meaning and purpose through his insights, the therapists and educators who apply meaning-centered approaches in their professional work, and the researchers who continue investigating the nature and conditions of human meaning-making. His influence extends beyond formal therapeutic settings to impact how people understand their own lives and relationships, how communities support individual flourishing, and how societies address collective challenges. The questions he raised about human nature, moral responsibility, and the conditions for authentic living remain as relevant today as when he first articulated them, requiring each generation to rediscover and apply these insights to their particular circumstances. The ultimate test of his contribution lies not in its theoretical sophistication, but in its practical capacity to help people live more meaningful, connected and purposeful lives despite the inevitable challenges and limitations of human existence. In this practical impact, Frankl's legacy continues to grow and evolve, demonstrating the enduring power of ideas that speak to fundamental human needs and aspirations.